If you're up against a horde of enemies in Warframe, then you know the drill. Click some heads with a turret, maybe throw a Zores and win. No big deal. The real challenge though is the increasing focus on big tanky bosses where, well, I think you get the point. So, in this guide, I'm gonna give you the best and strongest boss killer weapons in Warframe 2026, with builds so you can go and steamroll the big guys too. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members. Also, big shoutouts to WarframeFlo, Great Bardini, Xenosfire, KnightmareFrame, and Brozyme for making some great suggestions as to which weapons to put on today's list. And now let's get into the first weapon. And that would be one of the community favorites, one of the all-time greats, the Burst on Prime Incarnon. It sounds like a sewing machine, it has zero recoil, kinda like a sewing machine, and if you get it into the face, it hurts a lot. Like a sew. Anyway, point being, if you're playing Warframe, then you need a copy of the Burst on Prime Incarnon sooner or later. The way it works is incredibly simple. It's a burst fire rifle, you get headshots to charge the Incarnon mode, and then it is a fully auto rifle doing even more damage with ridiculous stats. If you want to take it into normal missions to mow down hordes of trash enemies, that is perfectly possible too, and most players actually use it this way. However, the Burst on Prime is one of the weapons on today's list, which is both great against hordes of small foes as well as the big dudes. Let's talk about the build though, shall we? First of all, because it is an Incarnon weapon, let's take a look at the Incarnon evolutions, but this time I'm going to do it a bit more rapid fire because I have a dedicated video on the Burst on. If you want to go into the details, check that out. Evolution 1 activates Incarnon mode, we don't need to talk about it. Evolution 2, very important, do not go for the one that gives you more multi-shot. Normally that's better for standard type enemies, but against bosses we're going to use the Acuity mod that we mentioned before, which disables multi-shot, so we take this one, that gives us more damage. This one right here is personal preference entirely. I like to go for less weapon recoil because of, sewing machine and stuff. And for the third one, very simple as well, go for more base critical chance because plus 22% is a little bit ridiculous. Looking at the build itself, this right here would be my boss type build. If you want to go against hordes of enemies, you would rather probably go for a blast build, something in this direction here, but against bosses, we want to have the raw damage. Acuity plus Deadhead, very deadly combination, and then the rest just focuses on a whole lot of, in this case, corrosive damage against, for example, Grineer Liches. Now, if you wanted to go and specifically use this weapon here against bosses only, then what I would recommend is instead of using the 60/60 mods for the element, just go for the big 90 elements, like for example also the prime ones if there is one. However, due to the fact that my burst on needs to fill a whole lot of different roles, I just didn't have the format to represent that. If you then go and combine this with a good status primer that inflicts a ton of different status effects, yeah. You saw that 4 million, right? The next weapon on today's list is sort of a late game player classic. If you're earlier in the game, you don't really appreciate it all that much, but once you fall in love, there is no going back. I'm talking about the Stalta. See, at first glance, this Corpus rifle looks pretty standard. Fully automatic rifle, plus it has an alt fire that was designed for pure neuron activation. What the game doesn't tell you though about the Stalta is that it has the magic feature of multiplicative condition overload. Now, I think most of us know what that means. Just in case you've never heard that term, I've made a full video explaining that on my second channel, but to break it down very quick and simple, it means that when you're using Galvanized Aptitude on the weapon and you status prime the enemy with a ton of different elements, then the damage output of the Stalta with the multiplicative condition overload feature is significantly higher than it would be with weapons that don't have this multiplicative feature. This makes it very, very strong against bosses. Now, let's also here take a look at the build, and you can kind of sort of see that we have some similarities compared to the last one. Again, Acuity plus Deadhead. Again, this example build here goes against Grineer, and if you wanted to, you could replace Serration with something else like more fire rate maybe, if what you're looking for is more the DPS rather than the single shot damage. Now, take a look at this. We now take this fully automatic weapon to town against these Eximus units without any priming first. You will see that we are already dealing damage in the 100,000s. However, once we add the status priming with multiplicative condition overload, yeah, that is still, by the way, a fully automatic weapon. If we go and now use the old fire, no further questions, Your Honor. In the next spot, we would actually have two weapons because I feel that they kind of sort of serve exactly the same role, and that would be the Felarx as well as the Kuva Hek. And in order to understand why these two are so good, we need to quickly talk about damage attenuation. This is a mechanic in Warframe that basically every boss type or elite enemy has, and what it does is it gives them a form of damage resistance against your damage output that scales with the DPS of your weapon. This right here is the rough formula for the calculation, just in case you're interested, but to break it down very simply, what damage attenuation does is, if you fight the boss with a weapon that deals a lot of damage, then the boss will have a lot of resistance against that damage to prevent you from just one-shotting them outright. There are, of course, a ton of invisible factors that go into this. However, one thing that I've noticed is that this damage attenuation needs round about a second to fully ramp up and kick in. In other words, if you hit the enemy like a freaking freight train with super front-loaded damage, then you can open the boss fight with one ridiculously high damage instance before their defenses are fully active. And that is exactly what these two shotguns do. First of all, let's talk about the Felarx. This bad boy here is one of the original Incarnons that you can get from the Zeroman 10-0 when you talk to Cavallero. Being an Incarnon weapon, it of course has Incarnon perks, so let's also quickly go over them. Perk number 1 activates the Incarnon mode. Perk number 2 is relatively up to personal preference. I personally think that projectile speed is nice, but you can pick anything you like. Right here in Evolution 3, also nothing specific, just go for whatever you want. What is more important are the last two. In the Evolution 4, you want to go for more status chance and reduced crit chance, because in Evolution 5, you're going to pick the perk that gives you plus 2000% damage whenever you don't crit. Now, the kicker here is that this plus 2000% damage is not base damage. This is a specific damage multiplier that is multiplicative to everything else you have, so it is ridiculously strong. The way we then go and build the Felarx is also a little bit different. Because we're not going for any crit here, that means we don't use a whole lot of mods that we would usually see on the weapon. In the Arcane slot, we're going to go for a primary deadhead for the headshot multiplier, but because we don't use Acuity here, we could also go for primary bulwark, which gives you even more base damage, and most importantly, it doesn't need any stacks that need to be ramped up for it to work in the first place. Depending on the boss fight, Bulwark in general can be a good replacement for Deadhead if you're just not convinced that you're gonna have all three stacks of this up constantly. For the build itself, you can of course go and change the faction mod, change the element to whatever you personally like. What you want to focus is that this number right here is as big as possible. That's your primary objective. Another thing that is different with the Felarx compared to other Incarnon weapons is that even if the Incarnon mode is fully charged, you don't want to use that, because the Incarnon mode turns the Felarx in akimbo pistols, and these are just not really all that amazing, at least not with the settings that we're using here. So for this one against bosses, we just want to use it in the normal mode because it has really nice damage. And then very quickly, the second weapon in this slot would be the Kuva Hek, and we're not going to go into more details here, right? It's essentially a shotgun that works similarly, dealing a lot of upfront damage, just that this one has a specific trait that allows you to alt-fire all 4 barrels at the same time into the enemy's face. Build here is relatively equal, just that for this one we're actually going to go for crit because there's no Incarnon perks and all whatnot. And if we now go and combine that with status priming... well, I didn't see the number particularly, but you can imagine that this is a lot of damage. Up next, we have a rifle that ridiculously surprised me this year. I totally didn't have it on the radar, but now it's one of my absolute favorites, and that would be the Perigale Prime. About this weapon, there is a lot to say, because it is very special. And I have a full guide that I highly recommend you check out later if you're interested. But for the sake of this video, we're gonna keep it a little bit short, so here we go. The Perigale Prime is a sniper rifle, but not a normal sniper rifle. It fires a 4-round burst. And if that burst takes out an enemy, or at least headshots with every bullet, then you stop consuming ammo for a bit. Being a sniper rifle, of course, that means it is inherently already good at delivering big damage numbers to big enemies. But what makes it even better is the same fact that also made the Felarx and the Kuva Hex so good. The damage attenuation of the boss enemy needs around about a second to ramp up. But with the Perigale, that means the entire burst hits the enemy before the attenuation is ramping up. It's just ridiculous how it melts bosses away. This right here is another Acuity boss build, with Deadhead, primary Acuity, but because we're dealing with a sniper rifle here, we also have Target Acquired, which further increases headshot multiplier. The elemental damage here is pure electricity, because I built it for using it in Parita Rebellion. But of course, if you take it against Infested, against Grineer, whatever, then you switch the element, maybe use a faction mod, you do you. In my opinion, the Perigale Prime is the single best rifle against big bosses. The only downside is that, due to the fact that it is a sniper rifle, it's gonna be difficult to take it against bosses that have small weak points and move around a lot, right? If you just don't nail those shots, there's no point in even playing it. The next weapon on today's list would be the first pistol for the day, and that is the Latum. Just like the Felarx, also this one here is one of the OG Incarnon weapons, and it has been one of the strongest secondary weapons in the game ever since. The way it works is relatively simple. In normal mode, it's just a semi-automatic pistol, and then once you switch it to Incarnon, it goes fully automatic and shoots explosive ammunition that not only hits like a truck, but also deals AoE damage. Being an Incarnon weapon though, we first need to talk about the Incarnon evolutions. Evolution number 2 is personal preference, but I personally find that fire rate is the nicest pick here. Then we have the one that gives us more reload speed. I find that nice because it can be a little bit tedious to stack it up and everything, but you go for whatever you'll say. And then with number 4 and 5, we have the same thing as with the Felarx. We increase status chance, reduce crit chance, and then go for the one that gives us 2000% damage on non-critical hits. Also here, these 2000% are multiplicative to everything else that's not just base damage. What that means for the build though now is a little bit interesting. Usually, I would say, we go for pistol acuity, deadhead, and have a big bada-boom damage. The thing though is that pistol acuity gives us crit chance, and crit chance is precisely what we don't want. So for the Latum in specific, we cannot go for pistol acuity. That is the reason why I focus on a lot of elemental damage and of course fire rate as well as multi-shot. This is very, very strong. The arcane choice here is not set in stone. I personally left it at Deadhead, but you can go for literally anything else. For example, Cascadia Flare gives you even more base damage, but you need heat in order to trigger it. But here is the interesting point now. Because the Latum shoots physical projectiles, it has multiplicative condition overload just like the Stalta that we just talked about. This means if we inflict the enemies with a bit of status, and then we hack away at them, we are dealing absolutely ridiculous damage numbers. Okay, so far, we've talked about the weapons that deliver the big numbers. However, what arguably is even more important, at least in my opinion, would be the support weapons that we use to prime the enemy to even be able to deal this amount of damage. So, up next, I would like to direct your attention to 2 specific weapons. First of all, that would be the Compressor Prime, the, in my opinion, absolute best single target primer in the game. This right here is Yareli's bubble gun, and it shoots explosive water drops at the enemy. These have ridiculously high multi-shot and status chance, plus they also explode in a little AoE, inflicting even more status. This right here is the build that I'm using on it, and it does look a little bit interesting because it only inflicts 2 different elements. So let me explain. Of course, if you want to, you can build the compressor with many different elements if you like. I personally though think that's not even all too necessary because as a secondary weapon, it has access to secondary encumber. On status effect, you have a 24% chance to get a random second status effect. And with all the fire rate and status chance and multi-shot that we have, we don't even need to bring that many elements ourselves because secondary encumber right here is the one inflicting all the bazillions of other different status types. Instead, what I focused on are the two elements that I personally care about the most, which would be viral to weaken the enemy and corrosive to reduce armor a bit. I personally decided to not use any galvanized mods because you need to get kills with the weapon in order to stack them up, and I don't really think that this build is all too strong. It's not supposed to kill, so really, I just wanted to have it completely stackless, just pull it out, use it, and not having to ramp it up first. Of course though, the compressor is not the only weapon that can do that. Technically, any secondary weapon can be used as long as you put secondary encumber on it, and it should have a lot of status application, meaning high status chance, high fire rate, yada yada yada, you get the drill. However, the second weapon that I want to talk about would be the Pseudo Prime. If, for whatever reason, your boss killer weapon of choice happens to be a secondary, like for example the Latum that we just talked about, you can of course not go and use the Compressor Prime in the secondary slot. So we need to outsource our priming to our primary weapon, and I think the Pseudo Prime is the perfect example here. This one shoots a disc that bounces between enemies and applies all 4 base elements: heat, electricity, toxin, and cold. In addition to that, you could put a build on like this here, which gives you more multi-shot, more status chance to capitalize on that even further, and you also mod more different elements onto it. It's not quite as good as a secondary encumber pistol, but it is still very nice, and I think my personal go-to primer whenever my primer has to be a primary. But okay though, now we're getting a little bit more interesting by talking about the first melee weapon on today's list. And to be fair, it's not necessarily one melee weapon, it's more a category of melees, and that would be heavy slam hammers. You know, I'm talking about the Arcatitron, the Sampotes, or the Magastar Incarnon. For the sake of this video, I'm going to use the Arcatitron because I already have it built, just saying that other heavy slam type weapons also work. The goal here is of course to use the ridiculously high damage numbers that heavy slams cause in order to hit the boss like a freight train. This right here would be an example build that I personally like to use, where I'm going to go for, of course, condition overload for the base damage so that we can turn all our status priming into more DPS. Because it is a heavy slam weapon, we use galvanized reflex because, you know, more multiplier equals more damage. But one thing I want to say here is, especially if you take it against a boss, you could think about maybe going for the Rauta as your primary weapon, because as you can see here, the shots of this weapon give you combo, so you can stack up the combo really high by just firing at the enemy, and then jump up and do a heavy slam and turn all that combo into ridiculous damage. Rest of the build is pretty self-explanatory: Seismic Wave for the heavy attack damage, Blood Rush for more crit, Galvanized Steel is actually our crit damage mod, plus giving us crit chance on the side, faction damage, if you don't have faction damage use something else, and so on and so forth. Oh, by the way, I just realized Galvanized Elementalist doesn't do anything for this specific build here, I just recently copied it over, so just, you know, use more damage or something in here. And this is how the whole thing would look then. First of all, we stack up our combo with the Rauta, then we use a weapon to prime the enemies, and then we can go and cast some skills to get our arcane up to maximum stacks, after which we jump and... Unfortunately, my combo went down there just 1 second before I hit, but you get the point, right? It is big damage number and it will definitely hurt the boss as well. Up next, we have another pistol-type weapon, and this one is also one of the community favorites of all time, the Dual Toxicist Incarnon. Now, with this one too, I already have an in-detail separate guide on it, so I'm gonna spare you most of the details here. Main point about this is, these are akimbo semi-automatic weapons, but if you have the Incarnon mode, then they turn fully automatic and they hit multiple enemies at the same time with ricocheting rounds. They're overall perfect to mow down hordes of enemies. However, similar to the Burst on Prime Incarnon, they're just so ridiculously strong that it makes them great boss killers too. Let's also here go into the Incarnon evolutions, where evolution 2 is actually very, very important. If you go up against crowds of enemies and you want to mow down the normal trash fodder enemies, you want to have this one here with more multi-shot. If you go up against a boss though, you absolutely have to use this one because we're going to use pistol acuity, and that means no multi-shot for us. Then in Evolution 3, you go for whatever you like. I personally like recoil because the weapon otherwise kicks quite a bit. And the last one, this one right here, I go for more critical chance because against bosses, toxin and damage over time and punch through doesn't really matter all too much. We just want to have the big numbers. The build itself then is another standard acuity build. Go for pistol acuity with a deadhead mod as well, and the rest is just overall, crit and damage and in the enemy's face. Okay, up next we have a suggestion from WarframeFlo, and that would be the Evensong unmodded level 0. Not just kidding, we're talking about Kullervo with any type of gunblade. Let me explain what's going on here. Now, when it comes to gunblades, then we all know these weapons are very darn strong. By the way, WarframeFlo has a full video dedicated to going over gunblades and their intricate details with builds and everything, so check it out, it's a great watch. But today, I want to talk about the Redeemer Prime as a sort of representative of the gunblade class in and of itself. Gunblades are melees that are technically ranged weapons, because they can shoot. They can do light shots, they can also do heavy shots that deal more damage. In the hands of Kullervo, the best melee frame in the game, we can give him red crits, so they deal a lot of damage, but of course, we can crank that up to 11. The build itself focuses on a whole bunch of damage, but because we're focusing on the heavy shots, we need to go for Galvanized Reflex in order to keep up with the combo. However, here comes a tip from WarframeFlo's video on the gunblades that I actually did not know. If you use the Evensong, I can unfortunately not showcase it because I've never even leveled it, but if you use the Evensong, then it has a special trait that gives you 35% multi-shot if you take out an enemy with this weapon. This is like a universal multi-shot bonus, and it also applies to the multi-shot of melee weapons. That is something that you can't mod for because melees don't have multi-shot mods. This, however, is a very strong combo. And then when it comes to dealing damage, well, check out this. First of all, we cast 4 abilities in order to get our maximum corrosive damage bonus on the Redeemer. Then we prime the enemies, and if we now shoot with a heavy shot, that's 20 million. That's 72 million. That's 238 million on a heavy shot. And last, but definitely not least, we have a super underrated weapon. Actually, it was one that I didn't even have on my radar, so thanks to Bardini for suggesting it. And that would be the Prisma Angstrom Incarnon. Now, this gun is one of the very few weapons on today's list that I have never talked about. There is no full guide for me to link here. However, for the sake of boss fighting, it's also pretty straightforward. It is a pistol that shoots rockets. If the rockets hit an enemy, you charge the Incarnon mode, no headshots needed luckily, and in the Incarnon mode, it shoots little projectiles. These projectiles do have multiplicative condition overload, and if you've stuck with the video until this point, then you know how strong that is, plus the weapon's stats in and of themselves are already great to begin with. Let's look at the Incarnon evolutions. In the first slot, I went for the one that gives me 75 damage and more crit damage multiplier. If though you have a frame with a lot of overshields, you might want to go for Haven Foray instead. Number 2, doesn't really matter all too much, I just went for projectile speed, but feel free to do whatever you like. And in the last one, I went for the one that gives me more crit chance as well as crit damage multiplier. The other ones aren't bad per se, but specifically against bosses, status chance kinda sorta doesn't matter, we have a primer for that. And on the other hand, more direct damage per status type, we already have Galvanized Shot, and that gives us 120%, so these 40 right here don't matter all that much relatively speaking. The build then is another standard acuity build where we focus on just dealing big numbers. You've seen it 1,000 times by now. If you don't need a faction damage mod, just replace it with even more damage, and just let me quickly show you how ridiculously strong these numbers get. And yeah, you see it right there, 24 million, 21 million, 19 million, 8 million. And now also check out my ultimate 2026 Warframe tier list right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtle Pier, Underkaneo 2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawk, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Herrn Tages, Peter Sader, Boomia1, Mr. Games, Zave, Arwindai, Zengen, Quax, Henrik 5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Yako Ivan Gonzalez, Candy Fox 19, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, good loot.